Hello, and welcome to your expectation maximization lecture. I'm really trying to have this be an extension of the Kmeans lecture that you covered last time, because Kmeans and expectation maximization with mixtures of Gaussians, which is just a mouthful. I'll usually call it Gaussian mixture models or expectation maximization. Is really related to K-means, and when I first learned this, no one really drew that parallel for me, and when I finally figured out all the math of it, I was like, what the heck? Why did no one tell me this? So I'm trying to present it in that way because I think it might be helpful for you. Now, just a note, expectation maximization is an algorithm that can be used for way more than what we're using it for right now. Right now, we're going to use it to cluster things, but just FYI, expectation maximization is an algorithm that is used for so many more things than that. So before we dive into the actual clustering part of it, let's really quickly review what a normal, or also known as a Gaussian, distribution is. You may have heard of it as like a bell curve, and things like standardized tests or height or weight or things like that are typically modeled as being a normal distribution. I have the formula over here. It's not important that you memorize it, but this is the formula that gives you this normal distribution curve. And what is important for you to know is that the normal distribution is symmetric, unimodal, and it has this really cool property that most of the data is in the center, and as you get further from the center, the data becomes less and less likely. So you can see from this shape here, you have like not that much data here, a lot of it here, again, goes down and not much here. Okay, so this is a normal, aka a Gaussian distribution, and these are going to be important because the expectation maximization we're doing is with Gaussian distributions. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So say you have some observed data that has this pattern. This in particular is the number of dollars spent on fast food per week. And say you see this pattern and you're wondering, what causes this pattern? Well, one explanation is that it's a result of having two separate groups that each have their own distribution. So for instance, we have the pink group and the blue group. The pink group might be the people who don't spend that much on fast food, and they tend to get less when they do go get fast food. And then you have people in the blue group who spend a lot more money on fast food, but tend to have a larger variance in the amount of money that they're spending. So you can kind of see from this plot how these two groups, when put together, would make this, you can see it on that one too, but would make this purple curve. So the idea is that when we observe data like this, we can often think, there's a bunch of latent, which just means unobserved, groups that make up this distribution, and I'd like to know what those groups are. So what we can do is use the expectation maximization algorithm with Gaussian or normal distributions. Hopefully you can kind of see how if we extended them out, these distributions are like normal distributions. We can use that to calculate, okay, what are the normal distributions that make up this pattern of data that we see? So really quickly, I'm going to talk a lot about the similarities between K-means and expectation maximization with mixtures of Gaussians, but let's really quickly talk about the differences. So when we do K-means, we assign each data point to a particular cluster. It's not a member of any other cluster. It is only a member of the cluster it's been assigned to. This is called hard assignment because the labels are like very strict. We don't change them. We don't think they're like wishy-washy, like they're hard labels. In contrast, with mixtures of Gaussians, what we can do is instead of saying this data point is in this cluster, we can instead assign each data point a probability of being assigned to each cluster. So for instance, let's look back at this picture. Let's erase these extra lines. They're very ugly. Okay, so say we have a data point that is right here. I don't want that color. Right here. So this person spends like $40.50 on fast food a week. So we could say, okay, well, which cluster would we assign this to? Well, it looks like if you draw a vertical line up, it looks like it's most likely in the pink cluster because this number is more typical of people in the pink cluster than it is of people in the blue cluster. But it's not like there's no one in the blue cluster that has this amount of spending per week. So we might want to, instead of saying it's in group A, that's it. Instead of saying that, we might want to say, well, there's a really high probability that it's in the pink group, but there's a small probability that it might be in the blue group too. And this is called soft or probabilistic assignment, because instead of saying it's in the pink group and having no flexibility with that, we actually say, well, there's a really high probability it's in the pink group, but there's a tiny probability that it's in the blue group. And this applies if we had multiple groups as well. Okay, so that's hard assignment. The other thing that is different between K-means and expectation maximization with mixtures of Gaussians is that in K-means, we had this assumption that all of our clusters were spherical. And we knew that assumption wasn't usually true, but it worked well enough, so we left it alone. However, sometimes this can cause really big problems. Like imagine if you had data where the clusters were like this. Take a million years to draw. I should have done them in different colors. That's okay. But imagine your clusters are like this. They really have this kind of oblong ellipsoid shape. But if you did K-means with them, you would assume that these clusters are spherical, and you might miss some of the pattern that exists within these clusters. So the way that expectation maximization with mixtures of Gaussians gets around this is by, instead of assuming that all of the variables have the same variance, they explicitly estimate what that variance is. So instead of spherical clusters where in all directions you have the same variance, it allows us to have like elliptical clusters, like something, I'm trying to get the blue, like something like this, where you can see that the variance in one direction is pretty small and the variance in the other direction is pretty big, and that gives us this elliptical shape. So just to review, K-means has hard assignment. Expectation maximization with mixtures of Gaussian, soft assignment or probabilistic assignment. K-means assumes that all your variables have equal variance, or really that your clusters will all have the same variance in every direction. EM with mixtures of Gaussians will instead explicitly model whether the variance is the same in all directions and will allow your clusters to not be spherical. Instead, they can have like rounded ellipsoid shapes. Okay. Oh yes, I made this meme for you. Just thought it was really funny because like Kmeans has hard assignments and a lot of your Chapman computer science professors have hard assignments. Get it? Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so just to review, K-means had a couple steps that we did, and it's an iterative process, so we're repeating some of these steps. But it had this iterative process where we first chose K random centers and then assigned all of our data points to one of those centers. Then once we had each of our data points assigned to a center or cluster, we would recalculate what that center should be based on all of the data points in that cluster. So basically every data point in that cluster had a little bit of a say in what the new cluster center was. Then once we moved our centers, we would recalculate what points were in each cluster, and then we would recalculate the centers and then reassign the points and then recalculate centers, etc., until things converged. And so I want to draw attention to this process because the expectation maximization process is actually really similar. Okay, so that was for K-means. Let's go over how a lot of these exact same principles apply to expectation maximization. So the first step is really similar. We're going to choose random starting points for each of our clusters or distributions. Now, just FYI, there are really cool ways of expertly choosing your starting points so that your algorithm converges more quickly. I'm not going to go into that here. It's way more than you need to know for this class, but I find it fascinating. And if you do too, I highly recommend looking it up. It's so interesting to read how people efficiently choose random starting points for expectation maximization. But for now, you can just assume they're kind of randomly chosen. So this is really similar to in Kmeans. Now, for expectation maximization, we talked about the fact that we do soft or probabilistic assignment instead of hard assignment. So instead of assigning each data point to a cluster, for each data point, we calculate the probability of being in each cluster. So instead of getting a hard assignment of you're in this cluster, you're in that cluster, we're instead going to calculate the probability for every data point that they're in every cluster. Now, using these, and these will be now probabilities, we're going to recalculate the means and variances for each of our distributions or each of our clusters. Now, since we don't have hard assignment, every single data point in our data set gets a little bit of a say in what the mean and variance of the distribution is. But it might make sense that if a data point has a really, really low probability of being in that cluster, then it's going to get way less of a say in what the mean and variance is compared to a data point that is very likely to be in that cluster. The math of this is not super important, although I'll link some resources that might help you dive into that math a little bit more. But essentially what I want you to know is that we are recalculating both the mean and the variance for each cluster, and that the probability of a data point being in a cluster means that the higher the probability, the more influence that data point has on the mean and variance of that cluster. Okay, so these two steps should seem a little different, but very familiar to the Kmeans stuff that we've done. And just FYI, the way that we call this, the expectation maximization, this step 2 is called the E or expectation step. And this step 3 is called the M or maximization step. And that's where we get the name expectation maximization, because we're going to repeat these two steps, the E step and the M step, over and over and over. And like Kmeans, we're going to stop once our clusters or our distributions aren't changing very much. So hopefully you can see how that Kmeans is very similar to this. Expectation maximization is a little more complicated, but it has a lot of the same structure. Okay, so I'm going to show you an animated GIF in a second. This didn't save as an animated GIF because PDFs are lame, but I just want to show you the way that expectation maximization works in one dimension. So we only have one variable here, or one feature, and it's along the x-axis. And I want to show you how it works in one dimension. This works obviously in multiple dimensions. We can use more than one feature to cluster our data, but it's a little bit easier to tell what's going on in one dimension. So this right now is showing you the first E step or expectation step, where these two, the green and the blue, are our random initial distributions. These are what we think our clusters look like, but obviously these aren't very great guesses. And so what we're going to do is we are going to probabilistically assign each of these data points to the clusters. Now I've colored the data points by the cluster that they're most likely to be in, but remember, we're doing soft assignment right now. So every data point has some probability of being in the green cluster and some probability of being in the blue cluster. Okay, let's look at the GIF. It's going to take me a second to pull up, so hang in there with me. Okay, it actually pulled up a lot faster than I thought, so let's wait for it to restart. So you can see at the very top, you can see the E or the M step that we're on, from one at the very beginning to the very end when it converges. And you can see what's happening is that the distributions are very slowly at first moving, And then you can see that some of the data points are changing which cluster they're most likely to be in. And this is supposed to reflect the fact that we're changing, right, both the probability of each data point being in a cluster, and then we're changing what is the mean and variance of that cluster based on all of the data points that are most likely to be a part of that cluster. So this is sort of what the algorithm looks like in practice. Of course, this is a very simple example. It's only in one dimension, but you can see how it's learning the shape of our two clusters, and you can see how the data points that are most likely to be in that cluster are really influential in the shape of that cluster and like what the mean of that cluster is. So I know this is very slow at the beginning, but then you can see, oh, it's speeding up. Okay. And then those are our final clusters and it restarts over. So I'm going to try and post this GIF somewhere so that you can see it as well as all of the individual images. So you can, like, if you really wanted to, walk step by step through the process. But I hope it makes a little bit of sense in the same way that K-means eventually converged on different clusters, that eventually the expectation maximization with mixtures of Gaussians eventually converges on two distributions that we think make up the data that we're observing. So these would be our final clusters, and we can either look at just the probability of each data point being in each cluster, or we can assign each data point to the cluster that it has the highest probability. So at the very end of this GIF, you can see like the green points we would say are in the green cluster and the blue points we'd say in the light blue cluster. But the nice thing about the soft assignment is that we actually have the probability for each data point that it's in each cluster. Okay, that was a lot of math and theory. Hopefully that makes sense, and I will see you for our Python lecture on Gaussian mixture models.